100 alien warships hang motionless in the void, their hulls reflecting the cold light of a distant star. Their formation is perfect. Layered ranks of destroyers, cruisers, and dreadnoughts, each vessel bristling with weapons capable of annihilating entire worlds. They are the Targari Dominion's hammer, a force that has crushed entire civilizations under the weight of its relentless conquest. They have never lost, they do not negotiate, they arrive, they demand, and they destroy, and now they have set their sights on Earth. Humanity's response? They send one ship, not a fleet, not an armada. A single vessel drifts toward the vast alien armada, alone in the darkness. To the Targari, it is an insult, a sign of desperation. Their commanders sneer at the primitive species' defiance, their war councils already planning the division of Earth's resources. They see nothing but an easy conquest, a species too foolish to know when it is beaten. But as that lone ship closes the distance, something shifts in the void. A silent tension builds. The Targari, so used to victory, feel something they have never felt before: doubt. Because what they fail to realize is that humanity does not fight like the others. History had already proven this. Humanity had never been the strongest, the largest, or the most technologically advanced species in the galaxy. But they were something far more dangerous. They were relentless. When faced with impossible odds, they adapted. When challenged, they innovated. And when pushed to the brink, they refused to break. It was this resilience that had allowed them to survive their own history of conflict. From the brutal trench warfare of Earth's early centuries to the vast interstellar conflicts of their expansion era, humanity had evolved under the harshest conditions. They did not fight fair. They did not fight by the rules. And when they entered a war, they fought to win, no matter the cost. The Targari Dominion had faced countless enemies before. They had encountered civilizations far older than humanity, species that wielded weapons capable of splitting planets apart. They had crushed them all with sheer force, and now they expected to do the same to Earth. They were about to realize they had made a terrible mistake. But before we continue, a quick message. Every great journey starts with a few brave explorers. Right now, HFY Chronicles-849 is just beginning, and your support means everything. If you enjoy unraveling the mysteries of the universe, hit subscribe. It's free, and it helps us grow this community together. Now, back to the story. The lone vessel drifting toward the Targari fleet had a name: the HSS Valiant. A name chosen for a reason. It was not the largest ship humanity had built. It was not the most heavily armed. And to an outsider, it appeared unremarkable. But the Valiant was more than just a warship. It was a statement, a challenge, a declaration that humanity did not need overwhelming numbers to win a war. The Targari commanders were confused. Their scans detected nothing extraordinary. No energy surges, no advanced weapons systems, no defensive shields powerful enough to withstand their fleet's firepower. The ship barely even registered on their threat assessments. To them, it was a joke, a final act of defiance before Earth's inevitable destruction. They prepared to erase it from existence. Orders were given. Energy signatures flared across the fleet as weapons powered up. 100 ships aimed their cannons, missiles, and plasma batteries at the lone human vessel. It was laughable, a mere insect in the path of a war machine. And then, it vanished. Not in an explosion. Not in an energy burst. One moment it was there, drifting through the void, its engines idling in the silence of space. And the next, gone. No jump signature. No warp trace. Just an empty spot where the ship had been. The Targari fleet hesitated. For the first time in their long history of conquest, they did not understand what had just happened. And then, before they could react, one of their warships exploded. But not from an outside attack. There was no energy beam, no missile impact. The explosion came from inside the ship, ripping through its hull like a fireball of pure destruction. Before the Targari commanders could even process what was happening, another ship detonated. Then another. And another. The fleet fell into chaos. Because the Valiant was not just a ship. It was a ghost, a predator hiding in the void. And it was hunting them. The Targari had made a fatal mistake. They thought war was about power. They believed, in overwhelming numbers, brute strength, and firepower. But humanity had long since mastered a far deadlier strategy. Panic spread through the Targari fleet like wildfire. Their ships, vast, powerful behemoths of war, were dying one by one, consumed from within by explosions that should not have been possible. The fleet's commanders barked frantic orders, demanding damage reports, countermeasures, anything to make sense of the unfolding catastrophe. But there were no answers. No enemy was visible. No weapons fire had been detected. It was as if some unseen force had infected their fleet, tearing them apart from the inside. The Targari, for all their centuries of conquest, had never encountered warfare like this. Their doctrine was built on dominance, overwhelming firepower, massive numbers, and sheer, crushing force. Their strategy had worked against every species they had ever faced. But now, against humanity, all their might meant nothing. Because they weren't fighting a conventional war. They were being hunted. The HSS Valiant was nowhere to be seen. One moment, it had been a solitary speck in the void, completely outgunned and outnumbered. The next, it had disappeared. And the Targari fleet had begun dying. To understand how, we need to look at the very nature of human warfare. Throughout history, humanity had never been the strongest species. They had never possessed the natural armor of the Zelarth, the regenerative abilities of the Vithar, or the raw telepathic power of the Solaris. But what they did have was an unparalleled capacity for strategy, deception, and adaptability. Unlike other civilizations, humanity did not fight in straight lines. They did not charge blindly into battle, hoping that superior numbers would guarantee victory. Instead, they studied their enemies, learned their weaknesses, and exploited them with ruthless efficiency. They fought with guile, misdirection, and precision. And above all, they fought to win. That was the philosophy that had birthed the Valiant. To the untrained eye, it looked like an ordinary warship. But in reality, it was the pinnacle of human warfare. A masterpiece of stealth, electronic warfare, and psychological manipulation. It was designed for one purpose: to dismantle an enemy fleet from the inside out. The Targari had never faced anything like it before. Their ships relied on centralized command systems. Efficient, yes, but dangerously fragile. The Valiant's first move had been to infiltrate those systems. While the Targari were still scanning for weapon signatures and preparing to fire, the Valiant had hacked into their networks, slipping past their firewalls like a shadow. It had rewritten targeting protocols, disabled communications, and, most importantly, triggered a series of cascading failures deep within the Targari power grids. The first few explosions were not from enemy fire. They were self-inflicted, reactor overloads, sabotaged from within. The Targari simply hadn't realized it yet, but that was only the beginning. Now, the Valiant was moving. It was there, hidden in the darkness between the Targari warships, its stealth systems rendering it almost invisible to conventional sensors. It didn't need shields. It didn't need brute force. Instead, it darted through the chaos like a phantom, slipping through gaps in the fleet's formation, striking before the enemy could react. And when it did attack, it did so with surgical precision. A plasma torpedo slammed into the command bridge of a Targari dreadnought, its detonation vaporizing the ship's entire leadership in an instant. The behemoth's remaining crew, now leaderless and terrified, panicked, its weapons firing blindly into the void. Another ship fell moments later, its engine core breached by a single railgun round placed exactly where it would cause a catastrophic meltdown. The Targari fleet was built for organized, overwhelming war. But they were not built for this. They were not built to fight a ghost, and that was exactly what the Valiant had become. The Targari commanders, still struggling to regain control, made their first mistake. They ordered a full barrage. Every ship in the fleet, all at once, was commanded to fire everything. It was a desperate move, but desperation makes people foolish, and the Valiant's captain knew exactly how to use that against them. Just as the first volleys of plasma, missiles, and laser fire erupted into space, the Valiant moved. A perfectly timed jump, short range, precise to the millimeter, placed it directly behind a cluster of Targari destroyers. The result? The Targari had just fired on themselves. Their own ships, unable to halt their attacks in time, were torn apart by friendly fire. Explosions blossomed across the fleet, dreadnoughts colliding with one another as their shattered remains drifted into their allies. The once perfect formation of the Dominion's war machine had collapsed, and the Valiant was still out there, still unseen, still striking with merciless precision. For the first time in their long history, the Targari Dominion faced an enemy they could not overpower. And for the first time, they were afraid. Terror gripped the Targari fleet. The chaos unfolding around them defied all logic. War, to them, had always been a contest of strength, overwhelming force crushing all opposition. Yet here they were, with all their might, their hundreds of warships, their fleet commanders and admirals, and they were losing to a single enemy ship. The Valiant was no ordinary vessel. It was a calculated nightmare, designed to exploit the weaknesses of adversaries far more advanced than humanity. It had been built not to conquer, but to end wars before they could even begin. Every part of its structure, every subsystem, was meticulously engineered to render enemy fleets into helpless wrecks, without them even realizing how. For the Targari, this was their first lesson in human warfare, and it was a brutal one. 3. Wreckage of their own ships now drifted through the void, dead metal tumbling in silence, the lifeless bodies of Targari crew floating amongst the debris. Some ships had suffered catastrophic power failures, their engines dark, their crews trapped inside as oxygen dwindled. Others were still functional, but barely holding together, their systems in disarray, their captains screaming for direction, as command chains collapsed. And still, they had no idea where their enemy was. The Valiant did not engage in direct combat. It did not announce its presence with shields raised or weapons blazing. Instead, it moved between them like a phantom, striking with terrifying efficiency. The surviving Targari ships were now attempting to reform their battle lines, a desperate effort to reassert control over the battlefield. Even in chaos, the Dominion's fleet was formidable. The remaining warships began linking their targeting systems, pooling their sensor data in an attempt to corner their unseen enemy. And that's exactly what the Valiant's captain wanted them to do. Because, as soon as they synchronized their targeting arrays, the Valiant's next attack struck at the heart of their system. A virus. Not biological, but digital. An aggressive, adaptive AI worm that infiltrated their fleet's networks. It spread through their linked systems in an instant, rewriting commands, overriding targeting parameters, and seizing control of critical functions before the Targari even realized what was happening. Suddenly, their ships turned against them. Dreadnoughts began firing on their own allies. Weapons that should have been locked onto enemy coordinates were instead redirected at friendly ships. Missile banks launched salvos at the wrong targets. Defensive turrets activated against their own hangars, tearing through their own fighter wings before they could launch. On board the bridges of these massive warships, commanders howled in confusion and rage. They were fighting their own fleet. The admiral of the Dominion's flagship, a towering Targari warrior covered in ceremonial battle scars, was one of the first to recognize what was happening. He roared at his officers, demanding a full shutdown of all electronic systems. "Manual control only," he bellowed, his voice echoing through the command deck. But it was already too late. A single, chilling transmission cut through the static of their failing communications. A human voice, calm, calculated, and devastatingly confident, spoke in perfect Targari. "You rely on strength. We rely on intelligence. You rely on power. We rely on precision. You came with an armada, believing victory was inevitable. But you never stopped to ask, what if you were already dead before the battle began?" The bridge of the Targari flagship erupted into a panic. Admirals barked commands at their engineers. Officers desperately pounded at control panels, attempting to override the rogue AI now strangling their fleet systems. But every effort was met with the same merciless response from the infiltrating program: access denied. Then, one final message appeared across every single display screen on every surviving Targari warship. A countdown. 10 seconds. 9. The admiral's eyes widened. He turned to his officers. "What is it counting down to?" 8. The Valiant had been inside their systems from the moment the battle began, and now it had one final move to play. 7. The Targari flagship's power grid began overloading. Lights flickered. Consoles exploded, showering the bridge in sparks. Across the fleet, every ship's reactors began to surge. 6. The Valiant's virus wasn't just shutting them down. It had rewritten their emergency protocols. Self-destruct commands had been embedded into every critical system. 5. Panic overtook the fleet. Officers abandoned their stations, running for escape pods. But even that was futile. 4. Every escape pod, every docking bay, was already locked down. There was nowhere to run. 3. The Valiant, unseen, watched from the darkness. 2. Across the fleet, hundreds of nuclear cores reached critical mass. 1. The entire Targari fleet erupted in a storm of blinding silent fire. A chain reaction of cataclysmic detonations consumed every ship in their armada, one after another. Dreadnoughts were torn apart by their own reactors. Cruisers imploded as their containment fields collapsed. Battleships shattered into pieces, sending flaming wreckage scattering into the void. The mightiest fleet in Targari history was gone. All that remained were burning fragments of metal drifting through space. And in the middle of it all, untouched, was the Valiant. Silent. Invisible. Watching. One ship. One crew. Against an empire. And they had won. For a long, eerie moment, there was only silence. The void, once teeming with the overwhelming presence of the Targari Dominion's fleet, was now littered with drifting wreckage, smoldering debris, and the fading echoes of destruction. The stars themselves seemed to watch in stunned silence, as if even the universe could not believe what had just transpired. And yet, despite the absolute annihilation of one of the most feared armadas in the galaxy, the Valiant remained. Unseen, unscathed, unmatched. Deep within the warship's command center, the crew of the Valiant stood in hushed awe. The battle, if it could even be called that, had ended. They had achieved the impossible. But there was no celebration, no cheers of victory, only the weight of what they had just accomplished, because they knew this was only the beginning. The aftermath of annihilation, the Targari Dominion had ruled the stars through fear. Their empire had grown through ruthless conquest, absorbing weaker species, annihilating resistance, and enforcing dominance with overwhelming military force. Their fleet was the very symbol of their supremacy. It was their ultimate tool of destruction, the hammer that crushed entire civilizations beneath its might. And now, that hammer was gone. The destruction of their fleet was more than just a military defeat. It was an existential catastrophe for the Dominion. It was unthinkable that they, the undisputed conquerors of the galaxy, could be outwitted, outmaneuvered, and utterly humiliated by a single enemy ship. The implications were devastating. Surviving Targari outposts in nearby systems received fragmented distress signals, broken messages filled with static, garbled screams, and frantic transmissions that ended in silence. The fleet was no more. The most powerful force in their empire had been erased in the span of minutes. Panic spread like wildfire. Governors, admirals, and warlords across the Dominion scrambled for answers. Had the humans developed some unstoppable superweapon? Was this the precursor to a full-scale invasion? How could they fight something they couldn't even comprehend? In a desperate attempt to make sense of the disaster, the Targari High Command convened in secrecy. The council chamber, an enormous, darkened hall adorned with the relics of past conquests, was filled with the grim faces of the Dominion's greatest leaders. Their voices were hushed, their words sharp with disbelief. "We lost everything. This isn't possible. There has to be another explanation. A traitor? A malfunction? No. We were outmatched, outthought. They played us like fools. The High Command knew that the loss of the fleet was not just a military failure. It was a symbolic one. If word spread that the Dominion's greatest force had been obliterated by a single human ship, then their empire's foundation, rule through fear, would crumble. It would mean insurrection, civil war. It would mean the end of the Dominion. The legend begins, for the crew of the Valiant, the battle had been won. But now came the most critical phase of their mission: disappearance. They had struck a crippling blow to the Targari Dominion, but their survival depended on remaining a phantom. If the Targari could not understand what had happened, they could never prepare for it happening again. And so, the Valiant vanished. Silent as a whisper in the void, it activated its stealth drives and disappeared from all known sensor arrays. Even the wreckage of the battle, the drifting remnants of the Dominion's once mighty fleet, would yield no evidence of what had destroyed them. To the rest of the galaxy, the battle would become a mystery. Rumors would spread. Theories would emerge. Some would claim that a cosmic anomaly had swallowed the fleet whole. Others would whisper of a new, untraceable human weapon capable of erasing entire armadas. Some would even fear that the humans themselves had ascended, becoming something greater, something beyond mortal comprehension. And at the heart of it all, a legend would take shape. They had brought a fleet. Humanity had sent just one ship, and that one ship had shattered an empire's illusion of invincibility. The unseen war, but the battle was far from over. In the corridors of the Valiant, the crew knew that while they had won this engagement, they had also painted a target on humanity itself. The Targari were not defeated. They were wounded, humiliated, desperate for answers. And desperation made them dangerous. Humanity's war was no longer fought with fleets and weapons. It was a war of shadows and perception. The Valiant had done more than destroy a fleet. It had altered the very fabric of interstellar power. The balance had shifted. The question was, how would the galaxy respond? And more importantly, would humanity be ready for what came next? The silence in the Targari High Command's war chamber was unnatural. Not the contemplative silence of strategy, nor the brooding quiet before battle, but the silence of pure, undiluted fear. The images of their once proud fleet, now nothing more than scattered debris orbiting the ruined battlefield, played on the massive tactical screens before them. Hundreds of ships, millions of soldiers, reduced to nothing. It was a human ship, one of the generals whispered, his voice barely above a breath. One ship. The words tasted like poison. They had faced formidable enemies before, rebel uprisings, pirates, even rival empires. But nothing had ever dismantled their forces like this. Their military analysts couldn't explain it. Their greatest scientists couldn't understand it. And that terrified them more than the destruction itself. Because the greatest power in the galaxy was not their warships, nor their legions of soldiers. It was knowledge. It was the certainty that they were superior, that their enemies could never surpass them. But now they had no answers, and fear, true, uncontrollable fear, began to creep into the hearts of the Dominion's leaders. A threat. They couldn't see across the Dominion. The loss of the fleet sent shockwaves through the Empire's infrastructure. Military outposts braced for an attack that never came. Planetary governors imposed martial law, convinced that the humans would launch an invasion. Cities were placed on high alert. War factories went into overdrive, and entire armories were emptied as desperate commanders scrambled to prepare for a war they didn't understand. But nothing happened. No human fleets appeared. No planets fell. No new offensives were launched. It was as if the humans had simply disappeared, and that more than anything was the most terrifying part. The Dominion was used to brutality, to ruthless enemies, to overwhelming firepower. They had faced and crushed countless civilizations who dared to stand against them. But this was something different. They had prepared for a war, but the humans had given them a nightmare. The human strategy, an unseen war. While the Targari Dominion scrambled in panic, the crew of the Valiant remained hidden, deep in the void. They had done what no species had ever dared to do. They had not defeated the Targari Dominion. They had done something far worse. They had planted doubt. A war wasn't always won with weapons. Sometimes a war was won with fear. And right now, the Dominion was crippled by it, Because if one human warship could erase an entire fleet, what could an entire human armada do? The terrifying answer was simple. No one knew, and that uncertainty was more powerful than any superweapon. The fear spreads across the galaxy. News of the missing Targari fleet spread like wildfire. At first, the Dominion tried to suppress it. Official broadcasts reported a tactical redeployment of the fleet, assuring their citizens that all was well. But whispers could not be controlled, and soon the rumors began. The fleet never made it back. The humans destroyed them. A single ship did it, just one. At first, many dismissed it. The Targari Dominion was too powerful to lose to a single ship. It was unthinkable, impossible. But the days turned to weeks, and the weeks turned to months, and the fleet never returned. And slowly, the galaxy began to believe. The Targari's allies, once loyal and subservient, began to hesitate. The races they had conquered, once afraid to rebel, began to hope. Because if humanity could do this with one ship, what would happen if the humans decided to end the Dominion entirely? The unraveling of an empire. The High Command knew they had to act. They could not allow the myth of humanity's power to take root, and so they did what they had always done. They launched a purge. Across the empire, entire planets were locked down. Military officials, planetary governors, even civilians were interrogated for spreading false information. But the more they tried to suppress the rumors, the stronger they became. Because fear was a disease, and once it spread, it could not be contained. The once mighty Dominion, the galaxy's greatest superpower, was beginning to fracture. Their enemies sensed it. Their own people felt it. They were no longer invincible. And that was humanity's greatest victory. The Targari Dominion had ruled the stars for centuries with an iron grip. Their military strength was unmatched, their technology unparalleled, their control over the galactic economy absolute. Empires had risen and fallen under their rule, and they had crushed every rebellion, silenced every whisper of defiance, and obliterated any force that dared to challenge them. But now, their mightiest fleet had been annihilated, not by an armada, not by a doomsday weapon, by one single human warship. The realization of this devastating truth sent shockwaves through every level of the Dominion's hierarchy. For the first time in their history, the unquestionable power of the Dominion had been challenged, and it had been proven fragile. And in the darkness of that revelation, something even more dangerous began to take hold. Doubt. A crumbling throne. The Targari High Command had always ruled with absolute certainty. Their decisions were law, their word was final. No one had ever dared to question their wisdom, because their empire had never lost. But the destruction of their greatest fleet was not just a military defeat, it was a psychological weapon. Every admiral, general, and strategist in the Dominion was now gripped by paralysis. Because how do you fight an enemy? When you don't know how they won, how do you retaliate? When you don't even understand the weapon that destroyed you. The human ship, the Valiant, had disappeared after the battle. Their sensors had lost it. Their scanners found nothing. Their tracking systems showed no signs of human movement. Had the humans left? Were they watching from the void? Or were they waiting for the Dominion to make its next move? No one knew, and that uncertainty was more terrifying than war itself. Rebellion brews in the shadows as the Targari leadership struggled to maintain order. Whispers of dissent began to spread through the empire. The Dominion had long ruled through fear, but fear had always been a weapon they wielded. Now, for the first time, that weapon had turned against them. Planets that had once submitted without question now hesitated when given new orders. Conquered worlds that had lived in fear of rebellion now sensed weakness in their overlords. And those who had once dreamed of freedom now saw a path to it. The myth of the invincible Targari Dominion was shattered, and once a myth is broken, it cannot be repaired. Across the empire, small groups of resistance fighters began to emerge from the shadows. They saw an opportunity where before there had been none. They saw an empire in chaos. They saw fear in the eyes of their rulers, and they saw a name whispered in the dark: humanity. the name of a species that had done the impossible. If the humans had defied the Dominion, maybe others could too. Maybe the Dominion was not invincible. Maybe it could fall. A desperate gamble. The Targari leadership knew that they had to act quickly. If the rumors were allowed to spread, if the people of the Dominion continued to lose faith, their entire empire could begin to fracture. So they devised a plan, a desperate, reckless, and brutal plan. They would launch an invasion of Earth, not a war of conquest, not a calculated military campaign. A message. The Dominion would send a new fleet, twice the size of the one that had been lost, and burn Earth to the ground. They would wipe out every trace of humanity, destroy every city, every colony, every world the humans had settled. They would make an example of Earth, and in doing so, they would send a message to the entire galaxy. The Dominion is still supreme. We cannot be challenged, and those who dare to stand against us will be utterly destroyed. The order was given. A fleet unlike any before was assembled. The most advanced warships in the Dominion, the most powerful weapons, the most ruthless commanders were called upon for one singular purpose: to end humanity. But as the fleet prepared for departure, as the war engines roared to life, as the massive battleships aligned their coordinates toward the Sol system, something unthinkable happened. The Valiant returned, and this time, it wasn't alone. The Dominion's grand fleet, a colossal force assembled from every corner of their empire, was poised to launch. Thousands of warships, each carrying enough firepower to reduce a planet to dust, were lined up in perfect formation, their crews prepared for what they believed would be the most decisive strike in the history of their species. The Targari leadership had issued one simple command: eradicate humanity. Leave nothing standing. Wipe Earth from existence. It was not just about military victory anymore. It was about dominance, about restoring the fear that had kept the Dominion's vast empire intact for centuries. But just as the fleet readied itself for departure, an alert blared across every command deck. Incoming energy signatures. Thousands of them. But they weren't coming from deep space. They weren't approaching from some distant system. They were already here. The heart of the Dominion, its most fortified military sector, had been infiltrated without a single warning, without a single alarm. A human fleet had materialized within the Dominion's own staging grounds. It was impossible. No known technology could breach Dominion early warning systems. No fleet, no matter how advanced, could have traveled across the galaxy and arrived undetected within the heart of Targari space. But the humans had. The Valiant, the single warship that had obliterated an entire fleet before, now stood at the head of an armada. And what an armada it was. The Targari commanders had expected crude, primitive vessels, ships barely capable of interstellar travel. Instead, they were staring at war machines beyond comprehension. Vessels that shimmered with an unknown energy, their hulls absorbing light itself. Silhouettes that seemed to bend space around them, their very forms distorting as if reality itself was struggling to contain them. The human fleet did not broadcast demands. It did not send warnings. It did not even acknowledge the presence of the Dominion's forces. It simply acted. Within moments, chaos erupted. The Dominion fleet, the largest in their history, began to fall apart before a single shot was fired. Their systems crashed. Their communication channels filled with static. Targeting arrays spun wildly, unable to lock onto anything. The very fabric of their technology was being undone. Ships went dark, their power cores failing in an instant. Some turned against each other, their weapons systems hijacked by an intelligence they could not comprehend. And then came the destruction. The human fleet moved like a force of nature, like something beyond warfare, beyond strategy. One moment, a Dominion battleship stood at the center of its formation. The next, it was gone, its mass reduced to atoms. In the blink of an eye, wave after wave of Dominion warships were erased from existence, their shields proving useless, their armor crumbling like paper. Even the mightiest Targari dreadnoughts, behemoths that had ruled the battlefield for centuries, were reduced to silent, drifting husks. The Targari High Command watched in horror as their fleet was not just defeated, but dismantled with a precision that defied understanding. There was no counterattack, no last stand. This was not war. This was a demonstration, a statement, and for the first time, the Dominion understood the truth. The humans had never truly revealed their strength. The Valiant had not been an outlier, not some lucky anomaly. It had been a warning. A single vessel, sent ahead to give the Dominion a chance to reconsider their place in the cosmos. They had ignored it. And now, they were facing the consequences. The last remaining Targari warships tried to flee, tried to scatter into the void and escape the nightmare unfolding before them. But there was no escape. Space itself seemed to shift around the human fleet, cutting off all possible routes of retreat. The Dominion's last remaining commanders, those who still clung to the belief that their empire could endure, realized the true horror of what they were facing. The humans had not come to negotiate. They had not come to conquer. They had come to end the Dominion. On the Targari homeworld, the ruling council gathered in a final, desperate meeting. Panic spread through the halls of power, their once mighty government descending into chaos. Generals, admirals, and planetary governors shouted over one another, each scrambling to find a way out of the inevitable. But there was no way out. The Dominion had always ruled through the illusion of invincibility. That illusion had been shattered. Across the Empire, news of the battle spread at an uncontrollable speed. Every world under Targari rule saw the footage. The mightiest fleet in history, assembled to crush a single species, had been erased as if it had never existed. The Dominion had been the terror of the stars. Now, it was a crumbling shadow of itself. Its subjects, long held in submission, understood what had to come next. Rebellion ignited in every sector. Uprisings erupted across 1,000 worlds. The Targari were no longer feared, no longer obeyed. The very foundation of their empire cracked, and within days it began to fall apart. The human fleet did not linger. It did not demand surrender, nor did it impose any rule. It simply watched as the Dominion consumed itself, as the tyrants who had once enslaved whole civilizations were torn down by those they had oppressed. And when it was over, when the last remnants of Targari power had been wiped from the stars, the humans disappeared just as suddenly as they had arrived. No one knew where they went. No one knew how they had accomplished what they had. The only thing that remained was the undeniable truth that humanity had forever changed the balance of power in the galaxy. Those who had underestimated them were gone, and those who remained would never make the same mistake. Because now, when the name of humanity was spoken in the depths of space, it was not with disdain. It was with reverence, with awe, with fear.